All right, looks like attendees are slowing down. Everyone's able to get in. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Cody Green. I'm a cloud solutions architect with F5 Networks, and today we're going to talk about automating your BigIP using Ansible. So what we're going to do is run through some slides. There's a lot of material that I'd like to cover. We'll hold Q&A to the second half, but we do have panelists that are here today. So feel free to ask your question at any point in time. If they can answer it, they will. If not, we'll save it to the Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. Everything we're going to talk about today, all the code we're using today, will be available on GitHub, and you're able to use that at any time. So let's just jump into it. So one of the biggest challenges that we see across the industry is network automation. From our 2009 application, the State of Application Services report, we found that 46% found a lack of talent as one of the biggest challenges to automate their network environments. For F5, this is something that we feel that we can help our customers address. And one of the things that we're doing is webinars like this and training like our Super NetOps to help get you over the hurdle and make it easy for you to start automating F5s in your public and private cloud. So today we're going to talk about automating and integration. For the first half, we're going to talk about deploying virtual BigIPs in a public environment like AWS or Azure. In this demo, we will be using AWS. We'll talk about application deployments to your BigIP using both imperative and declarative models. And we'll talk about application lifecycle, so things like day 2 operations. Then we'll touch on integration, such as CI pipelines and integrating with ServiceNow. Now, the integrations do feed into our series. Today, we're in webinar 1, focusing on automation with Ansible. In webinar 2, we will focus on infrastructure as code. And for webinar 3, we're going to build a full CI pipeline. We'll host each one of these sessions every month. And at the end of this presentation, you'll find a link to register for webinar 2, which will be a month from today. So when we talk about automation, it's not enough just to automate the deployment of an application. We really want to look at the full life cycle of the app. And what do I mean by that? What we want to do is handle the bootstrapping and onboarding of the proxy, and then automating the deployment of an app, which is what most of y'all are after today. Monitoring and telemetry is extremely important so that we can understand how the app is behaving and take action upon that. We will have future series or webinar series that can go over how you can leverage F5's telemetry streaming, or even things like our application visibility reporting that's already in the product that you have today. And then finally, the change, right? How do we address this information? Something as simple as I need to add a pull or remove a pull, or maybe something a little more complex, such as I need to pave and nuke my environment because we're doing types of greenfield or brownfield upgrades. Now, when we talk about automation, it's important that we distinguish between imperative and declarative APIs. Imperative was what most people are used to today. Imperative is where there's domain-specific knowledge. Someone like yourself is very familiar with F5. You know the processes that you must go through to start with, let's say, a pool, or you build the nodes that go into the pool and step your way up until you create a virtual server. However, this is, like I said, very domain-specific. Typically, when you take a new DevOps engineer or a site reliability engineer that's unfamiliar with F5, they may not have this domain knowledge. So in an imperative model, we have to take that knowledge and the state of what we want the app to be to end up with our automation. Declarative, on the other hand, allows us to treat this more like a drive-through. We're able to pull up to a service catalog or a menu and choose a service that we want. So in this case, I want a burger. Between the menu and the window where I get my burger, magic happens. I don't know what it is. I don't necessarily have to have that domain-specific knowledge on how to create the burger. It just magically appears. Now, this is where we want to get towards, because this allows your DevOps and SREs to remove a lot of the complexity and remove that domain-specific knowledge and start to automate using things like infrastructure as code. We'll touch on this in a few minutes. Now, how does F5 help you through these processes? F5 has released our automation toolchain over the last 2 years. And this is something that many of you may already be leveraging today. It's made up of a few components. The bootstrapping is where we provide templates, whether that is CloudFormation templates in AWS or ARM templates inside of Azure. Onboarding is where we help you do things like licensing, clustering, configuring network components of the BigIP. This is done through our Declarative API, which is part of our Declarative onboarding extension. The next is your app services, deploying them. That's part of our application service extension, AS3. You may have heard us talk about AS3 quite a bit over the last 2 years because it's something we've been trying to help our customers adopt. But this is really how you get to a point that you can quickly iterate on application deployments, but also give your app teams or your BUs, your DevOps teams, the ability to do the deployments themselves. And then finally, telemetry streaming. How do we take action on a lot of this data and make sure that we're scaling our environment or we're bringing pool members up and down based upon the health of the application? So there's a couple things we can look at. When we look at how we deploy these, they can be deployed directly onto the BigIPs in your environment. However, many of you, like myself, you have SLAs that require you to take change windows or outages to do upgrades. While these extensions, which are iControlLX extensions, do not implement themselves in the data path, doing an upgrade of them may still require the outage or the change window. So we can abstract these out into our API services gateway, which is a container, or you can run each one of these as their own independent container. This gives you the freedom to be able to iterate or add new automation functionality without having to upgrade your BigIP. We also allow integration through our central management, which is our BigIQ, and through our container ingress service. Now, container ingress service, many of you may know as Container Connector. In its next release, it will be rebranded because it's going to start using AS3 to configure applications when deployed through a Kubernetes cluster. Now, we're doing the same thing that we're advising our ecosystem partners to do. Long ago, when we worked on things like modules for Puppet or Ansible, we had to release functionality for each one of those. Now, there's some pros and cons to that, but one of the biggest challenges was when we released new features, it took time to iterate through each one of those product offerings to be able to give you that feature in your automation stack. When we back out and look at it from a declarative model, we can implement the feature once. And now Ansible, Puppet, Terraform, when they're all using that same declarative API, you get that feature as soon as it's released inside of AS3. This is very advantageous because we're not having to deal with a lot of the imperative shortcomings, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Now, why Ansible? For me, Ansible is a clear delineation from things like shell scripting or PowerShell scripting, where I started and maybe a lot of you started. One of the big differences for me was the introduction of idempotency, right? When I run a shell script, it executes over again. So if I was trying to deploy a Tomcat server inside of one of my Linux machines, if I run the shell script again, it's going to try to deploy the entire process again. Well, maybe only a subcomponent of that playbook failed or that shell script failed. Normally, I'd have to wipe the VM, start over again, and run the shell script. Ansible gives me idempotency so that I'm only changing what needs to be changed. So let's say, for example, I'm deploying that Tomcat instance and only, let's say, the certificate didn't install correctly. Ansible is smart enough to know that it only needs to change the certificate portion of it. It does not have to redeploy the entire service. It's also agentless. So that's advantageous for F5 because we don't want agents running on our device. We have published an API that anyone can consume. And so Ansible can run on the local host and make the API calls into our solution. It's also very modular. This means that, like Dev Central, where you can typically go and find examples of things you're trying to do, Ansible has the same capabilities. So it's very easy to go find examples or modules that have already done some of the tasks you're trying to achieve. And finally, F5 has over 113 modules today with Ansible, and we're publishing even more in the next release. So what are some of the requirements? Well, we need to have Python 2.7, and we need to have Ansible 2.7. Now, if you're new to Ansible, I highly recommend using things like a Docker container to run it in. Makes it a lot easier, especially on a Windows platform. If you are going to use Python natively on your device, we also recommend that you use virtual environment. So this allows you to do like upgrades of Python or upgrades of pip or Ansible without affecting all the libraries across your system. So in this example, we're going to be running Python and Ansible inside of a virtual environment on my Mac. And we're going to install Ansible, the F5 SDK. This is what allows us to use the F5 modules. And because the example works with AWS, we will be installing Boto 3 and Boto Core. Now, Ansible only requires 12.1 or higher from BigIP, but I highly recommend, if you can, leverage our latest versions, which is 14.1. 12.1 is so about 2 years old now. There's a lot of capabilities that we've added and a lot of automation capabilities that you can take advantage of in a 14.1 environment. And then finally, if you're following along after the webinar, you are going to need to set your AWS credentials, your private key, things like that. I've shared a link down here that shows you how to set that up, but that's just so that Ansible can make the calls into AWS on your behalf. Now, automate. I do apologize. We are going to be moving pretty quickly. There is a lot of content I'm trying to cover. But like I said, feel free to ask your questions at any point in time. The panelists will answer some. And then any that we think that we would be good to share with the community, we'll do towards the end. So one of the first things we typically want to cover is bootstrapping and onboarding an environment. So this is deploying our BigIP inside of a public or private cloud. There's a couple things that we want to do. For this example, we'll be using AWS. Now, when you deploy a BigIP in AWS or any EC2 instance or app into EC2, you need to be aware of the security, right? By default, you could publish a service that's available to the world. So one of the first things we want to do is actually obtain our public IP address and lock down the BigIP to our CIDR. So Amazon provides a nice URL that allows us to return the public IP address. Maybe you don't know it. This is a great way for Ansible to make that call and pull that variable back in. And we'll use that variable here in a little bit. So we're using the register method inside of Ansible to save our IP address so that subsequent tasks can take advantage of it. Now we get into deploying the CFT. So CloudFormation Templates gives you an ability to deploy an F5 inside of AWS or ARM templates in Azure and make it a repeatable process. Now, there's a couple things we have to look at. There's some common AWS variables such as region, VPC, subnet, SSH key, and instance type. If you've never deployed inside of AWS, most Linux machines are using public key and private key authentication. So this is how we log into a box on the first go. The things we're more interested in here are F5 variables. So the template URL, this is where the F5 CloudFormation template is stored. The image name, what is the AMI name that we're going to be deploying? The restricted source address for management and restriction for apps. So these are variables inside of the CFT that will automatically deploy your security policies, which makes it a lot easier to lock down your environment on a day one deployment. So for those two variables, you'll see that we're actually using the myIP variable, and we're going to lock it down to a /32, which basically means my IP address. Now, if you're deploying in a lab or a production environment, you would, of course, use your own CIDR ranges here, and you're probably not going to lock it down to just you. Otherwise, the app may not work. So once we've deployed the CFT, we want to set the password. By default, the F5 in a public cloud uses a random password, and you use SSH to then change the password. So F5 has an Ansible module that allows you to run TMSH commands. So the same TMSH command we would run in our own private cloud or our own data center, we can run in the public cloud to change our password. We're also able to do things like update policies or change other information using this command, but I'll show you a better way to do that here in a minute using declarative onboarding. So be careful, right? If there's not an API or a module to do what you want, this is a great command right here, the BigIP command, to get what you're after. But you always check with F5, check with your engineer. There may be another way to do it. And we want to make sure you're doing your automation in a way that's forward thinking, right? We don't want you to have to rewrite your automation scripts in the next 3 to 6 months if there's a better way to do it and something that is idempotent and more importantly can survive upgrades. We'll touch on that here in a minute as well. So declarative onboarding is an imperative API. It's an extension that F5 introduced in the last 3 to 4 months that allows us to do some really cool things like licensing or setting network attributes on the F5. Or one of the things that's a lifesaver for me is doing something like clustering. So if you've gone through our Super NetOps training, one of the things, like any good training we do, is we walk you through the long drawn-out process of clustering two F5s together. If you've never done it, it's over 300 API calls. And if you happen to get one in the wrong order, then it will fail, right? We use transactions to fail back gracefully, but there's better ways to do it. So what we do is we walk you through that process. We show you that this is a lot of domain-specific knowledge that you really don't want to know. go on a coffee break, we come back, and what you just spent an hour doing, we show you one API call using declarative onboarding to then do it very, very quickly. Let us take care of all the complexity, all the logic. You just simply make one API call. So what are we doing here in the declarative onboarding? What we have is an example of a declaration. So in this one, because I'm deploying in AWS, I am using pay-as-you-go licensing. So you don't see any licensing information here because I don't want any of y'all taking the license and using it in your environment. But we are configuring things like DNS, NTP, and the modules that I'm trying to provision on my BigIP. So in this case, we're doing LTM. Now, we're using the URI method inside of Ansible. There's nothing special here. We're doing a public API call against the F5 to install the module, and we're using our credentials to do that. Now, you saw earlier, we did lock down the management interface. So this isn't available to everyone. We typically will lock down the management interface to your CIDRs for your environment, or you may be using a Bastion or Jump host to access or manage the devices in your public or private cloud. Those are all good practices. Now, once the BigIP is now deployed, we want to be able to use it with Ansible. There's a couple things we can do. The easiest method is we simply add the elastic IP address for our management interface to our host file in Ansible. There's also an extra variable I'm setting here. In this case, I'm using a single NIC deployment of the BigIP. And in that scenario, the management interface is moved from 443 to 8443. So I'm letting Ansible know that so that when it makes API calls into the F5, we're good to go. Alternatively, you can use things like Ansible dynamic host scripts. This allows you to query AWS or Azure and dynamically pull back the F5s in your environment based upon tagging or specific characteristics of the F5. I've used both methods, and typically in the labs, I like to use the host file. It's quick, it's easy, but in a production environment, I highly recommend you look at the dynamic hosting scripts. So let's kind of recap what we've done. We've used a single playbook that allowed us to get our public IP address, deploy the CFT using the variables that we needed, and we waited for the BigIP to come back online. Now, this was another script I didn't show in the presentation for time, but you can see it in the GitHub repository. We're just basically pinging or trying to talk to the management interface until it's available. Think of it as a pause or sleep function if you've done scripting or coding before. We then change the BigIP admin password. We're doing that through SSH. And then all subsequent tasks from there are actually using the REST APIs. So when we deploy declarative onboarding and we onboard the BigIP, all of that's being done through REST. So this provides a fast and repeatable process to deploy BigIPs in your public and private cloud. So now we can move on to the next phase, which is deploying app services. So when we deploy app services, I mentioned there's two methods. There's imperative. This is where we're using Ansible modules. This is very easy for beginners or people that are new to Ansible, and it's great for brownfield environments where I may only want to do things like node management or change SSL certificates. However, if we're looking at greenfield type of deployments, F5 would highly recommend that you start to look at our declarative capabilities using our application service 3 extension. This gives you greater control and flexibility, and it also sets the framework so we can start integrating with CI pipelines like Jenkins or GitLab, as well as integrating to or getting ready for infrastructure as code. So let's take a look at the imperative method using Ansible modules first. Like I said, this is very, very easy to get going. There's tons of good examples and documentation on how you can use the modules that are already out there today, doing simple tasks like up and downing a node or enabling or disabling a pool member. We'll touch on this in the life cycle where we're doing day 2 operations later in the presentation. So some of the pros are your quick, easy up and running, tons of examples that you can use based upon what other people have done, and can simplify some of your day 2 operations. And when we do talk about declarative APIs and you have to define the entire declaration, day 2 can be a little trickier because you have to give the state every time. So that's both a pro and a con, and we'll touch on that as well. Now, the con to the Ansible modules would be you have to be cognizant of what version of TMOS you're running, right? So if, let's say, 15.0 drops this summer, you're going to have to wait for the Ansible modules to be vetted against 15.0, or they may have to be upgraded for 15.0. Now, that would typically go through the entire release cycle of Ansible, so you'd be waiting for 2.8 or 2.9, or you can use Ansible modules or roles through Ansible Galaxy. And this is a great way to get some of our new updates without waiting for the next version of Ansible. So again, there's no wrong way here. This is a great way to start. And I even know a lot of customers that this is how they do their production environments. What we're trying to show you is another way that when you really get into that phase 2 of your automation approach, how can we take it up to the next level and turn it up to 11? Well, this is where we get into application service extension. This is F5's Declarative API. This gives you a way to do common layer 4 through layer 7 tasks on a single REST endpoint. It's a JSON-based declaration, so you're defining the state of the app in that declaration. And then we support multi-tenancy by default. Now, I want to touch on this real quick. If you're doing any type of automation, we definitely want to be looking at multi-tenancy in that automation workflow. Why? Well, let's say I deploy app ABC, and then Robin turns around and he names his app ABC as well. The problem is whoever deployed last wins. You would potentially override each other. Now, we really want our automation stack to be dealing with change control or dealing with rollback, or RBAC, but that's not always the case. So if we're dividing things up into tenants, I have my tenant, Robin has his tenant. There's never an issue of us colliding or potentially overriding each other. It's also atomic and idempotent. What do I mean by that? I'm sorry, idempotency allows me to look at things in a sense that I will deploy the same service every time, and I will only change what needs to be changed. So this is important if we look back on that shell script reference I gave at the beginning. I don't want to redeploy the entire app if the only thing that changed was an SSL certificate, right? I just want to change that portion of it. Now, atomic means that it's independent, right? It's not reliant upon other processes. So this also means that Robin can be making his API calls and updating his apps, and I can be making mine, and we don't have to worry about conflicting with each other or waiting on one service to finish. Now, another cool component of application service extensions is that they support pool members via service discovery. What do I mean by that? Normally, when you're deploying through automation or even manually through the GUI, you have to know the IP addresses or maybe the fully qualified domain name of the pools. Service discovery gives us a really neat way to deal with automation, especially day 2 operations, so that we are dynamically finding the pool members using AWS or Azure's public APIs. So in that example, we're looking at tags against the API, and anytime a autoscale group scales or a new service is added and it has that tag, it's automatically added to the pool member. Now, some organizations that are further along in their DevOps processes are using service mesh products like HashiCorp Console. So we can also dynamically pull that information from Console to determine the pool members that belong to this app. But finally, for a lot of you that maybe you're not in AWS, you haven't gotten into service mesh, you can do service discovery using DNS. This is where we can define the FQDN, and we will pull the IP addresses or the A records out of that FQDN and automatically populate the pool. A lot of cool ways that you can do this, but it really helps address and speed up your automation for day 2 tasks. So what does it look like without AS3 in our environment? Well, typically, we would be making a lot of REST API calls. Now, you heard me before talk about clustering the BigIP and how many API calls that took. In this example, it's very similar, right? Maybe I'm just deploying an application, but I'm having to build the node. Then I have to build the pool. Then I get some information about the pool. Then I have to add the pool members, and that process repeats and goes on. So this is time consuming. It's also error prone. What we want to do is help remove that complexity. So you make a single declarative statement against the F5. You're simply defining the end state of the application. Let us deal with the many imperative calls that happen on the back end. So what are some pros to this design? Well, first and foremost, AS3 is the first API where we've offered a schema contract. What I mean by that is that we guarantee that that declaration will deploy the same application over and over again for an X number of years. This is typically a challenge, especially when you're doing automation in a public or private cloud, because things like Azure has a 60-day notice of API deprecation. AWS has a 90-day notice of API deprecation. So, you may have teams that are figuring that out, but let's be realistic. A lot of times we deploy our stack or our automation script, and we're wondering why it didn't work. Well, the reason it didn't work is the API changed. So what we're trying to offer you here is a schema contract that guarantees no matter what, that version or that declaration will always execute. This also helps in the sense of the BigIP. You can now be iterating and increasing the code versions. So let's say that we release 15.0 this summer. There's a really cool new security feature you want to take advantage of. You don't have to worry about saying, well, I got to test my entire automation stack. We guarantee that. We guarantee that you can take advantage of it and that that app will deploy just like it did before, even if you upgrade to 15.0 or 16.0 or 20.0, right? Now, what does the declaration look like? Well, it's a JSON payload. In this example, we're deploying a very simple app. We have right here our tenant. I mentioned before, multi-tenancy is important, so this is part of the core of AS3. Now, the tenant can be anything you want. For a lot of organizations I work with, the tenant is the business unit, or maybe a unique ID that they have for every group inside of Active Directory, or they're leveraging something through ServiceNow. The template and the class help us define what we're deploying here. So this is an HTTP-based application, and this allows the schema to understand what attributes are required further down. So here we're defining our virtual address, and we're setting our pool. Now the pool is referencing a JSON object. In this scenario, we're defining a basic monitor using HTTP. You have much more advanced monitors you can use as well. We're keeping it simple for this use case. And then our pool members. So in this case, we're defining a pool member of 2 workloads, and they're on port 80. And this declaration would deploy this application through the AS3 API call. Single API endpoint, and oh, I've got a period there, but it's management shared app services declare. And that's the same API endpoint, whether you're creating, updating, patching, or deleting. Now, for a lot of people, that declaration makes a lot of sense when I'm a DevOps engineer or I'm already doing infrastructure as code. When I work with NetOps teams that are just starting off, they look at that and go, maybe we can't create that just yet. Well, this is where the power of Ansible comes into play because I can templatize this using things like Jinja 2. So what we're doing here is we're able to create standardized deployment templates. I worked with a director of automation at one of my customers, and I think he explained it the best. He wanted vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. 3 flavors of load balancing, and that's all he wanted to offer to begin with, right? Keep things simple. Let's move away from all these unique snowflakes and let's get into repeatable processes. So we're creating Jinja 2 templates to address those 3 use cases. Now, eventually you're going to have some requests come in that are unique snowflakes, and when those snowflakes accumulate enough to make a snowball, well, now you know you need a new flavor of ice cream. So maybe the next one's praline, but you get the idea, right? We're able to create something that's repeatable and easy for our teams to deploy. Now, why Jinja 2? Jinja 2 offers some really cool functions that we may be used to if you come from a development background or scripting, such as variable replacement, filters, if-else, and loops. So in this example, it's probably going to look very familiar, right? You see the template, you see the class, but there's variables that we're looking for. Now, item means that we're looping through something. Down here, we're also looping through the pool members. So this allows us to be able to define 2 pool members or 60 pool members. The same template can handle both, versus if you were trying to hard code this, you'd have to build that yourself. Now, how do we combine all this together? Well, the cool thing about using Ansible in Jinja 2 is I can greatly reduce the amount of information I need for my user. So in this example, we're actually just pulling in a YAML file right here that has some basic information. Now, some of these could be default variables. That's really up to you and your organization, and you can minimize the amount of data that's actually required to deploy an app. But in this example, we're defining the app name, we're defining the tenant, we're defining the type of app, the service port, the pool members. So all of this looks familiar, right? These are some of the things that you saw in the declaration. Now, how is this being combined together? Inside of our playbook, we're creating a directory structure that matches our policy here. So one of the things you may notice is we're actually laying out locations. So this particular playbook and the input is capable of dealing with multiple data centers and deploying the app in each one of those data centers. So what he's doing is there's an app folder inside of the code repository, and then we're storing the data center underneath that, and then the tenant underneath that. Later on, we'll combine all of this data to build a single declaration to deploy to the F5. So once we've kind of defined the individual components of the schema, so Robin has his app, I have my app, Joe has his app, we all may live in the same tenant. So our push AS3 declaration, our push config playbook, takes all of that information together and deploys it for that single tenant in that particular data center. Now, again, we're using those app folders and we're combining all of those apps that belong to the same tenant together. Now, I mentioned earlier, there are some things that are difficult about day two operations, and this is one of them when you talk about declarative APIs. A declarative API expects the state to be defined every time. What do I mean by that? We typically are using a source of truth, meaning that I would like to store my data in something like GitHub so that that policy can be reapplied every time without fail. Now, most of you, the source of truth today is on your BigIP, and that's what makes upgrades very difficult, because typically we got kids clubs, right? We're scared that that upgrade may fail. What happens? We have large change windows. When our source of truth doesn't live on the F5, when it lives in something like GitHub, it makes it very easy for me to upgrade or pave a nuke or completely rebuild the environment at any point in time. But there again, that declarative API that's part of that process expects that state to always be defined. So in this case, we have to rebuild all the apps in that tenant when we issue the declaration out to the F5. If we didn't do this, if let's say there were 20 apps out there under that tenant, and then we just posted our declaration with one single app, well, you can kind of guess what happens. Those 20 apps go away, and that single app is what's deployed. So these are some things that it's a little hard to kind of concept right now, but we'll address some of these in the later webinars and help show you examples like using patching versus a put or a post, so that the patch allows you to only modify certain aspects of the declaration and not have to supply the entire payload or declaration every time. So what are we doing here? What we're doing is we're combining all of the app data, we're retrieving the information out of the data centers and the tenants, and then we're posting to the F5. Now we're pulling the F5's information, its IP address and its management port, out of our inventory file. Now, the other thing we're doing here is the body is actually being built by Jinja too. So what we're doing is taking that app data and doing the final wrapper with the tenant template around it. There again, we will definitely dive into this more in webinar 2 when we talk about infrastructure as code. So what have we done? Well, in this example, we've talked about 2 ways to deploy applications in your environment using automation with Ansible. I think most of you will start with Ansible Modules. It's by far the easiest way to get going, and it's a great quick win in your environment. As you become more mature with that, we will help you look at things like using declarative APIs, whether that's through webinars like this or taking our Super NetOps training, which is available for free today. If you've never taken it before, I highly recommend it. You can go to f5.com/supernetops. And we provide 3 classes. They're about 5 hours each. And F5 pays for the public compute environment for you to run these labs in. You could take it as many times as you like, and feel free to ask questions from your SCs or your local community. So we've talked about creating or deploying the proxy, deploying the app. Now comes probably the more difficult thing, change. It would be great if we're able to deploy something and never touch it, right? Unfortunately, a lot of us have been in IT for a long time, and caring and feeding for something is kind of the bane of our existence. So doing things like pull members up and down, right? Who's ever been on a change control call at 2 a.m. and the only thing you're doing is bringing a pull member in and out? We really want to simplify this. And F5's offered ways to address this, such as BigIQ, but automation is really where a lot of people want to do this process so that we're not having to log into another pane of glass. The app team of the business unit is able to change it on their own. So let's jump into some lifecycle management. So common day 2 operations, like I mentioned before, are things like add and remove pull members. It can be enabling or disabling pull members, and things like updating SSL certificates. And they do expire, right? So we do need to upgrade them over time. So in this demo, we're going to touch on doing node enabling and disabling. The reason I focus on this one is for a lot of my customers, especially in public and private cloud, this is what they like to use because they typically know the IP address of the EC2 instance, and it's a lot easier to search for that. So if you were manually deploying your F5s, using the GUI or APIs, if you've done node configurations, you know that the node can be named the IP address, or you can come up with a crazy name for the node, right? I've seen some really cool things, and I've seen some things that make me shrug. If we're looking at automation and we were targeting the name only, this would be difficult. I don't know what Vince named his nodes, right? But I want a way to take them offline easily. Well, the cool thing is you can collect information off the F5 and disable the node by IP address. So let's take a look at that. The module we're using here is the BigIP Device Fax. So this allows me to pull as much information as I want off the F5, or for interest of speed, I know in this case I only care about nodes. So what we're doing is we're gathering just the node information off the targeted BigIPs in my host group. Now, once we have this, we want to loop through it and only disable nodes that you are trying to enable or disable. So what do I mean by that? Right? You could take the easy way out and just issue the API call against the F5, whether the node exists or it doesn't exist on the F5. What's the caveat with that design? The caveat is that if I issue an API call telling that node to be disabled and the node doesn't exist on that F5, Ansible is going to look at that as a failure. And so the problem with that is it's going to look like your Ansible scripts did not execute correctly, when in reality, the node never existed. So we can use that gather fax information to ensure that we're only applying those calls against F5s that contain those nodes. How are we doing it? So we're using one of the features, which is a loop. The loop allows us to look at all the nodes that were inside of this BigIP device fax. And then we're saying, in this case, those become items. And then if the item.address, while we're inside that loop, happens to live in our list of nodes we're changing the state for, then we're going to run this process to change the state to our desired outcome. So this is really nice because we're somewhat idempotent here, right? We are only affecting things that have to be changed. And we're not just trying to blast this script across the entire environment, which could cause a lot of errors and noise in our logs. Or maybe you're taking your automation stuff and sending it into Splunk. It's going to look like there's a lot of errors in your automation, when in reality, you shouldn't have done the node up or node down against that BigIP because the node didn't exist there. So now let's switch over to integration. So how can we take some of this automation and work with the tools that our business units or our developers are using today? So one of the biggest asks I typically hear is integration with CI pipelines. So for those of you that may not be familiar, a CI pipeline is a really great way for developers to do things like unit testing or regression testing of their applications. So what this typically allows us to do is to kind of work in an environment where I can iterate quickly and I can validate that the changes I've made to the code base have not affected the code that everyone else released. Now, CI tools are not new. What may be new for you, a lot of you, is using CI tools to deploy infrastructure as code. So in this scenario, the CI pipeline is not only validating that the code is not breaking or destroying the environment, but it's also deploying my infrastructure stack. Now, there's some really good benefits to this. I've been in both development and operations throughout my career, and the bane of my existence is a developer telling me it worked on my laptop, right? If I never hear that again, I would be happy. But in reality, they're right. They were able to write the code once. They were able to run it on their laptop, and everything was fine. What was missing? The thing that was missing is they didn't have a production stack. They had no way to validate that the web application firewall or the firewall would block things when they deployed it. So for me, when I write applications today, I typically start with Minikube on my laptop. I write my application, and when I feel like I'm to a point that I can start putting it into the central code repository, I create a branch. When I create that branch, at that point in time, the CI tool builds out a production-like environment for me. So now I can guarantee that as I check code into the CI, my application security tools are also being evaluated, right? This is a key concept when we talk about marrying dev and ops so that we're in a DevOps type of mindset. We want there to be continual feedback back and forth so that if I check in code and, hey, all of a sudden the WAF blocked that, web application firewall blocked that particular code, and it thinks that it's malicious, it's an attack, well, we're able to work together to solve that. Now, all that being said, how do we get there? So a lot of your CI pipelines today natively support Ansible. So this is really cool because the work that you've already been doing to help automate some of your processes also help lay the foundation for your developers to use their CI tools to do things like day two operations or even maybe full deployments of a BigIP. Now, there's a couple ways we can do this. There's by far a lot of your CI tools have the ability to run a container And then inside the container, you can tell it to add things. You can tell it to install Ansible, install these pip modules, and then download or check out the Ansible playbook and then run the playbook. Well, the other option too is you can spin up your own custom container. A lot of the people I work with prefer the second option because there may be custom libraries that they need to use. An example would be you're integrating with things like ServiceNow, or you're integrating with other components. Maybe you've written your own Python CLI wrapper and you're putting that inside of your container. Either way is fine. What we're trying to do is make it very, very easy for something like Jenkins to spin up and then run our Ansible playbooks that we've created to then go take action in our production environments. This is what we'll talk about in webinar series 3. So we'll get into a lot more detail here and actually help walk through how we would build the pipeline. And then probably the second most common request is, hey, automation is cool, but I got to integrate it with something that my business organization uses, like ServiceNow. So you may be using ServiceNow for some different capabilities. You may be using it for the full lifecycle control, as well as configuring and deploying things. ServiceNow has the ability to make raw API calls, and there are examples of making those raw API calls against an F5. And the example that we're looking at here, we're really looking at using it with something like Ansible Tower. Why? Well, Ansible Tower allows me to take my playbook and wrap an API around it. So now I can let ServiceNow do what it does very well, which are things like request forms, workflow approvals, and storing configurations in its CMDB. Now it sends that data into Tower when, let's say Robin's requested a change and it's gone through management approved it. Well, what if we can't execute that change right now? Well, Tower has the ability to say, well, wait a minute, you're trying to run this playbook. First off, does Robin have the rights to run this playbook? Is he part of that business unit? Secondly, you can do things like job scheduling. So this is where I can make sure that maybe this update only happens during our change window. And when that change window is happening, Ansible Tower will automatically execute the changes. So maybe Robin's adding a pull member, deleting a pull member. Well, guess what? I didn't have to be on the call at 2 a.m. Ansible Tower is doing that job for me. The other thing it's giving me is that logging and reporting. So if the playbook was to fail, Ansible's giving me detailed information on why the playbook failed so that I can take action and I can look at my automation to figure out, is it an input issue or was it a logic issue inside of my scripts? Now, Tower can target either a BigIP or a BigIQ, which is our management platform. So let's touch real quick on why you would use one or the other. There's a lot of app telemetry that's available for you in BigIQ 6.0 and higher that really gives you detailed information on how the app's behaving, how the client's behaving, and what's going on in your environment. You can leverage that information when you deploy application templates through BigIQ, or you deploy using AS3 or Declarative API through BigIQ. Now, if you've looked at our Ansible modules, you may see that there's not as many Ansible modules for BigIQ as there are for BigIP. This is something that we're working on in 2.8 and future releases. We will be increasing the number of modules that are available to BigIQ because we want you to be able to send that into BigIQ and get the telemetry you're after. Now, if I'm doing something like AS3, well, BigIQ can proxy that AS3 declaration and send it into the BigIPs on my behalf. There's some advantages here. One, normally in this environment, we would have to be exchanging credentials, right? How does ServiceNow talk to Tower? How does Tower talk to BigIQ or talk directly to the BigIP? In this scenario, if the AS3 declaration is coming from Tower going into BigIQ, BigIQ just simply needs to know the device name. And then BigIQ has the credentials and the information on how to communicate with that BigIP. So it's a layer of abstraction that allows us to have a little more security in there. And then secondly, we get the really cool analytics and dashboards BigIQ offers. Now, that being said, if we're in an environment where, let's say I'm working with a development team that's really down the DevOps path, and they don't look at BigIPs as cattle or as pets, they look at it as cattle. They're really doing infrastructure as code. In that scenario, Tower may talk directly to the BigIP, and the telemetry is actually being sent off to things like Prometheus and Grafana or Kafka. And this is some of the stuff we'll talk about in the next webinar when we discuss infrastructure as code. So there's another option when we talk about ServiceNow, and this is the model that I prefer because it lays the foundation for infrastructure as code as well as our CI pipelines. So in this example, the normal user could go through the same ServiceNow workflow that they're used to. However, we have ServiceNow store those variables. So if you think back to when we deployed the app, we had that YAML file with certain attributes. Well, now ServiceNow is just storing that inside of GitHub, and we have a source of truth, which allows us to have a repeatable deployment process. Now, GitHub can either use a CI or webhooks to talk to Tower, and we go back through the process that we were used to previously. One difference in this example is we're showing how BigIQ has the ability to put out dev, UAT, and prod environments based upon a single request from ServiceNow or GitHub. Now, I mentioned the infrastructure as code. This is where I could have another team down here that's using Jenkins or GitLab, and their check-in of their code causes Jenkins to then fire off API requests to ServiceNow or directly to Ansible Tower. Why is Tower in both of these processes? Well, it's important because what we want to avoid is unique snowflakes, right? Remember back when I mentioned the vanilla, chocolate, strawberry methodology. We want to ensure for you that you have repeatable deployment processes that are easy to troubleshoot. So if my NetOps teams or my app teams that are going through something like ServiceNow fill out information here, and my DevOps teams are going through their code repositories in Jenkins using infrastructure code, Tower allows me to use those templates to ensure that each one of them are deploying the same type of application. Now, long term, right, you may give those DevOps or SREs the ability to create their own AS3 declarations, but this is a great starting point because it makes it very easy for you to templatize a deployment no matter how people are consuming it. And guys, let's be honest, we all go to conferences, something new and shiny shown to us, we come back and go, ooh, I want to do that. So in this case, you know, Joe's kid may go and create the next new great automation tool. Well, we don't want to have to go back and try to rewrite everything towards that. With Tower, we're able to go, hey, that's cool. You've got a new product. Here's the single API call that you make to Tower, and we can then deploy that same application over and over again. So many of you may be going, hey, my brain's full. This is a lot of information. I do want to stop and we'll pause for Q&A and then we'll touch on follow-ups. But this is a lot of data. What we're trying to do is show you the potential that's available for you to address automation no matter what stage you're at. I mentioned before, you have Super NetOps training available for you that you can really start to dig in deeper if that's where you want to go. Or we will be publishing a series on Dev Central as well as videos that get more specific into each component of some of the tasks we took in this webinar. As I mentioned, the code repository is available. I will show you that link here in just a minute. These slides will be in that code repository. So you can step through the tasks and the playbooks that we did in this example. And we, because of the hour, had to move through pretty quickly. So why don't we go ahead and open it up for Q&A, and we'll take a look at some of your questions. So Robin, was there any that you thought we should address first?
Yeah, and there's in the QA section, there's a few that have been upvoted. There's one at the top there by Jeff McDonald. You can read that.
Okay. So currently running AS3 3.7 against BigIQ targeted version 12.1.1.2. Can I post new declares and build tenant against the Docker container? Oh, sorry, he can, but can't get or delete against the container. So is this a version dependency? I don't know, right? If you should, there should be no difference. If you are using the Docker container, you should be able to create and delete. If you're not, then you may be running into a bug. So I would say if you haven't opened a GitHub issue, please do that so we can take a look at your particular example and make sure that if it is a bug, it gets addressed. Now, AS3 is part of our digital transformation, where F5 is actually using Agile and DevOps processes. So we create epics every 2 weeks, assign them to sprints, and we typically release a new version of AS3 after 2 sprints. So we're always adding new features and trying to address bugs. So if you've run into a particular one, then let's see if we can find out what it is. So in-state would love to post, git, delete all AS3 configs against the container. Bonus question, can the container be used in Kubernetes? Yes, the container can be used in Kubernetes. We just have to make sure that if you don't have an F5 as the proxy or ingress, control in the Kubernetes, then we just need to use the kube proxy so that we know the node port and IP to target. Next one, can I reach AS3 via OSS core Ansible? So there's no module required if you want to use AS3 or declarative onboarding with Ansible. Well, I say that. The native URI module is the only thing that's actually required. We are introducing some roles. We've had customers come back and say, hey, I really want you to have a role or a module to work with AS3. So we've answered those, and you'll see those in 2.8, but it's not required. And the examples you'll see in the GitLab repository, I'm just using the URI module of Ansible to make the AS3 calls and even install the iControlX extensions. Anthony, can I change the order of pulls within a wide IP? So I believe in the declaration, we're concerned about the order they show up in. So if you are reordering those, I believe that would do what you're after. But maybe that's a good one that we test out in a follow-up session. So sorry, Anthony, I don't have a direct answer for you there, but we'll definitely test that out ourselves. Corey, are there any modules, packages, or tools available that can generate AS3 declarations from existing objects? So this is a common question. We're looking at ways to help customers that are in brownfield move to AS3. Primarily, AS3 was looking at greenfield. And why is that? Well, a lot of our customers that we work with on brownfield, these may be applications that were deployed 6, 8 years ago. If you're unaware, F5 does support a lot of our appliances from birth to grave for almost 12 years. So for lack of a better term, sometimes there's crap in, crap out, right? We really want to take this opportunity to ensure that whatever we're migrating is using the latest and greatest practices and that we're doing a deployment how we would recommend it today. All of that being said, yes, those are things that we're looking at. There is some early code that was written by an F5 engineer called John Alum. His code's available on GitHub. I think he also did a Dev Central article. I'll look into that. But he wrote a script to do TMSH commands to pull information and create AS3 declarations. However, that being said, we are looking at ways to make that easier for you. Misa, can this be integrated with BMC Remedy? Absolutely. Well, when we talk about our partner ecosystems, AS3 allows us the ability to declare or provide a single API endpoint. And only the declaration is where the schema is being built. So as long as Remedy has the ability to build that declaration, then it can target the endpoint very easily. So I've worked with customers where they wanted to integrate things like maybe, sorry to mention a competitor, right? But VRO VRA. VRO VRA didn't natively have integration with AS3. Now, that being said, our partners at Solve Labs did write an extension to their VRO VRA offerings so that they can generate AS3 declarations through the GUI of VRO VRA. So if a partner wants to do that, or even if BMC wants to look into ways to do that, we're happy to host a session. But yes, it is quite easy as long as that product can make an API call and build a JSON payload, we're good to go. Dominic, is there integration between on-site F5s and using F5s in the cloud? Do you recommend on-site and cloud F5s be connected and synchronized? So as far as integration, if your latency is low enough, the F5 doesn't care. So I see this in some scenarios where maybe we're deploying F5s in Equinix to front end the public cloud. So this is where we're kind of doing a cloud interconnect. So as long as the latency is low, the device service clusters can be across different networks, but they have to share the same public IP address. What we typically see is that if an on-site F5 and a cloud F5 need to have the same application, you're using automation so that everything but the virtual IP is the same. And the virtual IP is being switched out based upon the environment. Richard, one thing I've hit on is adding, removing a subnet of the items attached to something like a virtual server. For example, if we have some policies on the virtual, but want to add a new one, the Ansible task currently seems to only, whoops, I lost it. Okay, I think that one was marked as answer. Oh, no, there it is. Thank you. But want to add a new one. The Ansible task currently seems to only support placing all of the existing policies plus the new policy. Your comment earlier seems to indicate this is by design. Richard, sorry, I'm having a problem fully understanding the question. Robin, are you understanding what Richard's asking?
Let me put some thought into that, and I'll maybe type an answer out while you.
I'm sorry, Richard has another comment as well. This bites us because, as far as I can find, there is no way to gather the fact for the virtual, including a list of policy. I tell you what, Richard, my email address is part of the registration. Shoot me an email with your information and this particular issue and maybe the playbook if you can, and let's take a look at it. Let's see if we can get it addressed for you. So sorry we weren't able to answer that live for you, Richard. Jimmy, are there plans for Ansible modules or other automation solutions for APM-related tasks? So Jimmy, yes is the long answer, or the short answer. What we're looking at for APM is there are some things like security policies or access policies that quite frankly are hard to automate. I mean, one of the differentiators of F5 in the market when it comes to access management is the visual policy editor. So how do you take something like the visual policy editor and break it down to APIs and that's actually usable? So F5 is looking at new ways to look at this and address this, but I don't have a good answer today, right? Those are things that we didn't want to just drop an API and go, here you go, right? We wanted to make sure the solution that we develop is usable. So some components of APM are accessible through APIs. I don't know that we will ever release all the capabilities of APM through API because we have to rethink how you would do that through an API. An API may not be the best way. So you'll definitely hear more from us in the coming months on some ideas of how we think we can solve that. Let's see, next question. Do we have any demo for Kubernetes AS3 integration? So this is coming, right? So when we introduce, right now, if you were to use Container Connector uses CSOL to automate the F5. So that's an imperative automation against the F5. When we introduce cloud ingress services, I think it's with the next 2 to 3 months, that's where we'll have AS3 for the first time in that cloud solution. And so that's where we'll be able to actually kick off AS3 through a Kubernetes config map. So that's definitely just around the corner and will give you what you're looking for. Now, for those that are not familiar, Container Connector, Container Ingress Services, they are completely free. They're part of your support contract. So it allows you to integrate the F5 into your Kubernetes clusters and use it as your ingress service. All right, so is there a best practice for configuring blue-green deployments through the F5 in Ansible? And that's an anonymous attendee. There are some ways that we recommend doing it, but how about this? Infrastructure as code, this is one of the key components we typically deal with when we're working with IAC. So I will make sure that we cover that in the next topic, but in the meantime, I'll post something into the GitHub repository that gives you some examples of how to do that with some of the tools that we've used today. So we're at the end of the hour. I appreciate everyone attending today. I do want to share the information so we can get back into what's next. So check out the webinar repository. It's on GitHub underneath my repo. Please register for the next webinar where we'll talk about infrastructure as code. And then finally, give us feedback. Was this useful? What are some topics that you want to see? And you can get that through this particular Office 365 forms. Again, I will put this into the code repository. I will also send out an email to everyone that registered that contains this information. And I would like to host a live session tomorrow, but I'm having some difficulties with with YouTube right now. So I will post on my LinkedIn, which is LinkedIn. My user ID is Cody B. Green. And friend me on that, or follow me on that. And if we are able to get the technical issues worked out, we'll do a live Q&A tomorrow for anyone that has questions when they work through the lab, maybe tonight or tomorrow morning. Again, thank you for joining today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next call. Have a good day.